Welcome everybody to the second session of the day for Agile UX Virtual Summit. Today we've got Austin Knight here, who is at HubSpot, and I will actually drop in his website here because he has a lot of great resources. He runs a podcast as well as writes regularly about design, so you guys can check out his work there. I'll let Austin introduce himself, and then we can just dive right into it.
Awesome. So yeah, Jerry, thank you so much for having me here, and everybody that's tuning in from all around the world, thank you for being here right now. As Jerry mentioned, I'm a senior UX designer at HubSpot. So if you're not familiar with HubSpot, we are a software as a service company based out of Boston, Massachusetts. And we produce all-in-one marketing and sales software that businesses can use to grow. So as a senior UX designer at HubSpot, I oversee the user experience for, can you all hear me right now?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear.
Okay, we were just getting a couple people saying no sound. So, all right, cool. So I oversee the user experience for HubSpot.com. It's a pretty high impact website. It receives around 10 million hits per month. So we have a lot of different intricate processes around how we design and build for that website. And that's what I'm going to touch on today. So a little while back, UXPin and I did a cool little ebook and an article about how we applied Lean UX at HubSpot, specifically to a homepage redesign that we did. So in that case, we had just redesigned our homepage over a period of a couple months. And it was an interesting story of figuring out how to apply Lean UX in an environment like that. We have since applied the same process to a redesign that encompassed all of HubSpot.com, which was a much larger project. We learned a lot more in that process. And so that's what I'm going to touch on today. Now, I know what you're probably thinking when you see this title, something like, I don't think this stuff really makes very much sense, right? Because these two things, lean and enterprise, they're not very like each other. In fact, you could argue that they are entire worlds and galaxies apart from each other, with so many other approaches and barriers in the way of ever doing something like Lean UX in an enterprise organization. Lean is very fast, it's iterative, it's something that you associate with Agile teams or startups, and it focuses on learnings, whereas enterprises are much slower, a little more bureaucratic. Maybe they take a more waterfall approach. Sometimes they want to kind of stick their heads in the sand and not actually learn things, like how Lean focuses. So it feels like these things would not commonly be associated with each other. But we actually found some pretty good methods for moving those barriers out of the way and bringing Lean and enterprise a little bit closer together and forming what I would like to call a Lean enterprise, which for all intents and purposes, HubSpot is an enterprise. We're over 1,600 employees. We're a public company. We have multiple products. We have global offices all over the world. So we are an enterprise, but we still, in a lot of ways, function like a startup, and design is no exception to that. So that's what I'm going to dive into here, and I'm going to break this out into two different sections. The first of which is going to give you a look at our unique approach to Lean UX, and then the second is going to give an overview of a case study on how we redesigned HubSpot.com. So first we'll look at the process and how we created that process, and then second, we'll look at how that process is applied in a real project. So I'll start with the process itself and how we arrived at it. When I joined HubSpot, our design organization was sort of broken out like this. We had research and design and engineering in different and separate silos within our team. So, and this is specifically the team that's working on HubSpot.com. I'll talk more about teams across the organization, but right now I'm focusing specifically on that team. So we saw that research was happening in one team, and they were focused on data and conversion rate optimization and copy and all that stuff. And then there was a separate design team that was mostly focused on visuals and what the site would look like. And then there was an engineering team that was basically just tasked with building all of that stuff when it got sent to them. So naturally, we saw something that looked like a very waterfall process. And this was super awkward because the rest of HubSpot was agile by every definition of the word. We were quoted in articles for it. We had agile scrum masters on our teams. Everything that they were doing was agile, except for this one team that was kind of over there taking more of a waterfall approach. So we wanted to figure out how we could improve that. And the first step that they really made was by introducing UX as a layer that sort of overlaid itself on top of all three of these organizations. And that happened when I was hired onto the team as our first UX designer. We've since expanded beyond that, but at the time, this is basically what we looked at. And I realized that in a lot of ways, UX could be the glue that would hold all three of these things together and in a way unify them. Because research, design, engineering, those are essentially the three core competencies that a UX designer would be expected to have. We do all of those things. And so all of these different teams within this one organization were all kind of doing things that could sort of funnel up to and be held together by user experience. So we brought them together and we saw that a lot of collaboration and cross-communication started to be facilitated when these teams viewed themselves as all being one and the same as opposed to being separate entities. And within that, overlapping work started to occur. So research wasn't happening all at once and then being handed off to design and so on and so forth. They were doing these things collaboratively and as an exchange. And essentially what we had developed here was a little bit of a rough lean process. So this started to feel like we were going down the lean and agile path. And at that point, we decided, okay, it's time to put pen to paper and develop an actual formalized process around this. So I started by interviewing a few of the key designers and people that were involved in these teams before I was at the company. And we created a process that looks like this. Super simple, super straightforward, but there are a few key things to note about it. The first is that it is iterative and cyclical. So this process does not necessarily happen linearly, but rather it happens in cycles over and over and over again. And it's also fluid. So we'll see that depending on the project and scenario, certain parts of it will either be omitted or included at different times. You can start at different parts of the process. It really is intended to adapt to every single project and its unique needs. If you look at it on a timeline and in comparison to some of the other methodologies that I've talked about here, we'll see that waterfall is basically just this long process of teams internally building things and handing them off to each other. And then at the end of that process, sometimes around 6 months to a year that this can take, they'll release their product or their design, and then only then do they get feedback on it. And usually that feedback is never acted upon. It's been released, that's it. In Agile, we take a little bit more of an iterative approach where we'll build for a short period of time and then release it internally. So this is where we get like these alphas and early releases of products, but not to the public. We're just trying to create a stable build internally and make sure that we've got all of our ducks in a row. And then once we're there and we've got a stable build, we'll release that to the public. And then we start to get feedback from people that are actually using the product. Lean attempts to take that entire process and shorten it and focus on getting the feedback from real users and customers as quickly as humanly possible. So we build what could be called a minimum viable product or an MVP, basically just like the simplest and easiest version of something, the most basic functionality that you would need in order to release it and get feedback and then use that information to drive what you're going to be building next and the direction that you're taking the product in next. So it's very, very focused on quick releases, quick iterations, and using feedback from your actual customers and users to drive your decisions as opposed to your own internal deliberations and political ties. If we were to look at lean and how those think, make, check cycles happen on this timeline, we'd see something like this, where basically every single time that we build, release, and get feedback, we're going through that process of think, make, check, think, make, check, think, make, check, over and over and over again. And we can use the information that we get from that check phase of the project when we're getting that feedback to drive the next cycle. This is a look at the deliverables that we'll see come out in one cycle of the Lean UX process. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening here, and you'll see that some of them will be overlapping or happening twice in a single process. Few key things to remember are that we don't do all of these things every single time that we go through a Lean UX cycle. It's really just a matter of figuring out what is necessary in order to reach the goal where you can have something that you can release and get feedback from. So sometimes you're going to be doing paper prototypes, other times you're not, and it's all dependent on the project. And I think that's really the beauty of Lean, is that it recognizes that there is no textbook process that you're going to be able to perfectly apply to any team or product or scenario. It needs to be fluid and adaptive, not just to the company and to the team, but to the specific projects that they're working on. At any point, we can see in the think phase, we're going to be performing research and strategizing. So you might create some scenarios and then take those scenarios and use those to inform the design through wireframes, mock-ups. And then when you launch that design as a live product, you're going to be collecting data on it to see how it performs in the check phase. And that's going to inform what you do in the next iteration in the think phase. In the same way that we have a very simple process and a very focused process, I believe in using simple and focused tools. So all of our research and content, whether it be quantitative or qualitative data, our design requirements, our copy, everything is contained in Google Apps. Anything that can be documented, we just keep it in Google Apps. We sync it across our teams using the Drive, so docs and sheets and folders, and that's where that stuff lives. And we know that we can always go in there and find the copy or find the research whenever we need to. Then when we have actual designs, we'll use various different prototyping and collaboration tools to keep the designs in one place, demonstrate their functionality, allow our stakeholders to comment on the actual designs and give us feedback there, and then actually hand off the assets to the developers through that same place. Ongoing communication happens through Slack. A lot of teams are set up like this now. We'll create a Slack channel specific to every major project that we have. Video conferencing happens through Zoom and Loom, two products that weirdly rhyme with each other and mostly do the same thing. But basically, Zoom will happen. We'll use that for on-the-fly conferences, and then Loom whenever you've got something that you don't want to write down and you think would be better be communicated through a video. We can easily do that with that product. And then we report all of our results in an internal wiki or an intranet that we've built using Atlas and Confluence. So whenever a project happens, we'll document everything that we learned from it, our successes, our failures, and the results that came from that, and basically create a case study that is then published internally at HubSpot. And we can use that to go back and reference things that we've done in the past, or also to help inform the rest of the company, since we're a fairly large organization now, what's happening within our team. And then naturally, we'll schedule regular stand-ups and reviews. Because Lean lends itself to a lot of different work happening all at once, where you'll see copy being written at the same time that some rough designs are happening, and then based off of those rough wireframes, you may have developers creating rough prototypes or scoping out the code all at the same time. With all of these moving parts, it can be really easy to lose track of where the project is at and what people are working on and what you need to be doing next. So we make sure that we schedule regular stand-ups and reviews so that we're always in sync and working appropriately. And then all of this is ultimately documented in Jira, which is our project management and communication system. So we've got a pretty intricate Kanban board that runs all of our projects with tasks and timelines, deliverables. And then we've got tasks and subtasks where we will basically log everything that we have in Google or in our prototyping tools, or important Loom videos that come up. All of the results from that will be logged in a Jira ticket, so you know that you can go to the Jira ticket and get a total overview of everything that's happening in the project at any time. And what this ultimately allows us to do is rapidly and regularly release thoughtful solutions that are supported by user and business data. So we're doing this fast, We're doing it a lot. We're putting a lot of thought into it. And the reason why we're able to put that thought into it is because we're using actual data that we've collected from our users and from our business internally to inform these designs. So that's cool. That's an interesting process. It's one that we talk about a lot, but rarely do we ever get a chance to really see how that is actually applied in an organization, especially in enterprise. So I want to walk us through a case study of a HubSpot redesign that we ran recently, where we focused on HubSpot.com, and give you all a look at how this process is actually applied in a real project. Now, while I'm calling this a redesign, it's really more of a major iteration, or for that matter, you could say a refactoring, because redesign would imply that we're going to be throwing out all of our design elements, a lot of our learnings, and kind of starting from scratch, and we never really do that. You can see how our process wouldn't really lend itself to that. We're really just going through a major iteration as part of this project, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the context of a refactoring and why we started to view it as more of a refactoring than anything else. But the easiest way to put it is that if you think of that timeline that we were kind of looking at earlier, and you break it out by the year or by quarter, we'll see a lot of small iterations and experiments and little product releases happening throughout the year. But then eventually we'll go through one big iteration where we take all of these previous iterations and everything that we learned and bring them together and unify them in a single large iteration, and do a lot of the bigger stuff, that the heavier lifting stuff that we wouldn't be able to do in like a couple weeks cycle. So that's what we were doing here, and our project was really focused on this type of a design. This is what the homepage of HubSpot.com looked when we started to approach this project, and the rest of the site generally looked a little bit like this, but it was pretty ambitious. HubSpot.com is a big website. As I mentioned earlier, it gets around 10 million visitors per month. That generates 60,000 leads per month, which then converts into over $270 million in revenue per year. And the site also serves our customers. We're not just selling software on it, we're also allowing them to access and use and learn about the software through HubSpot.com. And there's over 30,000 companies that are doing that, and they're based in more than 90 countries throughout the globe. So we're dealing with a lot of different languages and cultures and technologies. And then ultimately, over 2,000 pages are logged in Google for the HubSpot.com domain. So it is huge in traffic, huge in revenue, huge in customers that it's serving, and huge in sheer bulk of data that it contains. So you wouldn't generally see a lean process applied to something like this because it's such a bulky property, but there were a few unique things that we did that allowed us to do that, and I'll go into detail on that. The first critical thing that we did, that we always do, is we set very focused goals so that we knew exactly what we should be focusing on and why, and we didn't get distracted by the other several thousand pages or countries or visitors that wouldn't be related to this project. We had to know what we were working on and why, and completely focus on that. The first goal that we were looking at was user experience on a more general level. We were really focused on the underpinnings of this design and what made it tick. And the reason for that is because we had observed that it was experiencing a bunch of what I like to call design debt, which is sort of what I was hinting at a little bit earlier when I called this a refactoring. If you're familiar with tech debt and refactoring a tech stack, this will you'll kind of see a commonality between design debt and refactoring a design. So to put it in the most simple of terms, whenever you create a design from the start, where the whole design was created from scratch all at once, all of those elements in that design were created within the context of each other, and you were kind of aware of those other elements when you were creating that design. But inevitably, you launch the design, and then you want to improve on it. You want to up your conversion. You want to make it a little bit better looking, or whatever improvements you want to make. You start running tests and changing some elements around it. You get the data back on a test, and it performs well, and so you keep that element. And then you run a few other tests. Maybe one of them fails, because that happens from time to time, so you get rid of those elements. But then you run another test, and it succeeds. And you keep going through this process of running these tests and getting data and seeing them succeed or fail and keeping elements until eventually you have a design that is performing very well quantitatively, and it's sort of this collection of all of these different tests and learnings that you have, but it doesn't really look that well, and it's not very easy to use. You look at the design and you're like, this is odd because it's converting really well, and that was what was happening in the case of HubSpot.com. But if you just go through the site and you try to use it, it feels like it's a bunch of stuff that was thrown together. And that's because it was. It was this huge combination of a ton of different experiments and learnings that we had pulled from those experiments. So eventually you have to refactor your design and go through the process of bringing all of those learnings and elements together and creating them within the context of each other so that you once again have a unified design that feels bespoke and it feels thoughtful. We also wanted to take a look at our creative direction. This was one of the primary directions that we had taken with the design, but as we went to different parts of the site, we would see that some teams were taking things in a completely different direction because it's a huge site. It's over 2,000 pages. We had some debt there, and we didn't fully know what our creative direction was. So users could potentially feel like they were on a completely different site multiple times throughout their experience on this single domain. And then we also wanted to focus on conversion, the things that got people to buy our products and retain on our products and continue paying us money to use our products. And then we also had several products, new products that we would be launching and offering in our multi-product lineup. And the important thing about this was that not only were they critical to the way that we would approach the design, they also had very finite launch dates. So we would be launching all of these products at Inbound. It's our annual event where over 20,000 people come together, sort of like Google I/O or F8. And we talk about marketing, we talk about software and design, and we launched some new products there. That was happening on November 8th of 2016, which meant that we had roughly 3 months from start to finish to complete this entire project. So that was okay. Usually you'll see a lot of lean UX processes will not have like finite deadlines. They're just kind of always occurring. But because we had a hard deadline in this case, we basically just saw a bunch of the stuff that would be happening would just be overlapping different lean UX cycles all at once. So design would be happening at the same time as dev and at the same time as copy and all of that stuff. It was a very quick and multi-layered project. In order to make sure that we really focused on these 4 goals that I've listed off to the right, we developed some concrete metrics that we would measure the design by. And they were essentially focused on the quality of the design itself and then the conversion rate that that design pulled. So we were looking at usability and user acceptance testing and the conversion and click-through rates for our products, as well as the revenue and retention that would result from that in the long term. And these weren't just sort of fluffy goals that we put out there. We were actually really testing against them both during the project and after. So we were running SUS, Usability Hub, Validately to make sure that we were taking the design in the right direction. And we were tracking over 90 different unique conversion flows. And we set increase percentages and metrics against each one of those conversion flows uniquely based off of how much we thought we could increase the conversion for each flow. And that would basically be our goal. So very hard metrics that we were focusing on. But even with all of this sort of upfront speculation and research that we did for this project, it wasn't really enough to justify launching the project at this point and making such a large investment. So we wanted to make sure that it was genuinely a good thing to do and something that would benefit the company. So we started pre-kickoff with an MVP test where we wanted to see, okay, if we take this design in a completely different direction, do some of this aspirational stuff that we've been talking about, will it net an outcome that would make this large refactoring of HubSpot.com worth our time and worth the company's investment? So I got together with one other individual named Matt Barbie, and we launched a test that was based off of the design that you're looking at to the right. That's the test that we launched. In order to arrive at this design, we basically started with our style guide, which had been created over course of several years and by amazing efforts from designers at HubSpot. And we lit that thing on fire. And we said, yep, we're not going to pay attention to any of that. We're going to do whatever we want with this design and get as crazy as we want to and just see how it performs. So we started with some guerrilla research, getting out there and pulling data that we previously didn't have access to or using methods that we previously wouldn't have used. And this led us to take a completely different approach with our messaging and tone of voice. We were speaking in a way that the brand had never spoke before. We used illustrations, which we had never done before, and we incorporated a bunch of drop shadows that I later realized were just hideous, but we used them for this design and we were proud of it. We introduced a completely different color palette and CSS animations and interactions that previously weren't present in any of our designs. And we took a completely different approach to our conversion in terms of how we got users to move down the funnel and what the funnel actually looked like. And then we launched all of this without telling anybody. So we put this thing live, and nobody really knew about it. And we just prayed that it was going to do really well. And it turned out that it did. We improved the conversion rate with this test by about 20%. So we were pretty happy with that. That's fairly substantial. And we also managed to get users to like it as well. We did a bunch of usability and user testing throughout the process of the design and the launch, and it passed. So we knew that we could get pretty substantial results by going in a direction like this. So basically, what I'm saying here is that if you want to do really well and improve your conversion rate in your design, you basically need to take everything that your company has built for your style guide and all of the rules that you have and throw those out the window and then just design whatever you want and then launch that without telling anybody. And then it doesn't matter if it succeeds or not. You can still brag about, I'm kidding. We actually found out that a lot was wrong with this design. While a lot of things went well, there is ultimately a reason why two rogue individuals don't generally determine the design direction for an entire company and why we don't design like this. But we did manage to learn a lot from this project. And to be fully honest, we actually knew ahead of time that it was going to perform pretty well. We did our research up front. We ran pre-launch heat maps on PNGs. We did post-launch heat maps, and we saw that there was major parity between the two. And we didn't just do this quantitatively, we also did it qualitatively. So we tested those designs in user tests with users when they were just PNGs and we hadn't touched a line of code. And we knew that this wasn't something that was going to send our company off the rails or anything like that. It was still just an experiment that we felt comfortable with. And then when we did prove out the concept that this was going to be a good investment and that we could have measurable results from it, we formed a team. And the key here was that we formed what I like to refer to as a SWAT team. So a small team that was very focused on the specific roles and tasks that they were given. This started with 3 executive stakeholders. We wanted to limit the amount of, you could say, high-paid opinions that we needed in order to convince that the design was where it needed to be. So we wanted to limit the approvals process and just have key partners from each critical part of the organization that we could run everything through. So we had one person that was 100% of brand input, 100% of marketing, and 100% of growth. We then assigned a DRI for each part of the project. So you'll see there was one UX designer, that's me, one visual designer, we had 3 copywriters, a couple developers, but this was a pretty small team. It was 12 individual contributors that would be tasked with doing this entire project. And there was a reason for that. We didn't want to have stakeholder bloat. And another cool thing about this is that we were all based around the globe. So we had a bunch of people in our US headquarters, some people remote from California in the US. We had a bunch of people from Dublin, Ireland. We have an office over there. And then we had individuals that are remote. I'm in Brazil. I designed the entire UX for this project from Brazil. We had copywriters in Canada and New Zealand. So there was some really cool international collaboration that happened here. And even though 12 individual contributors might seem like a lot of people, if you consider it in the context of our 1,600 plus person organization, it's less than 1% of the company that would be determining the direction for the site that is really the lifeblood of our organization. So it was small, it was autonomous, and it was fast moving. And that's really a big thing to keep in mind, is that in big companies, or for that matter, in any company, keeping a team small and focused is going to help you avoid scope creep and stakeholder bloat. Once we had the team established, we moved into the think phase, where we started to perform some research. This is the first part of that lean UX process. So one individual here was just asking, what is DRI? I apologize if I'm throwing around some acronyms here. DRI is directly responsible individual. So that's the person that was, as an individual, they were fully responsible for user experience, or they were fully responsible for visual design. So for me, if something went wrong with the UX, that all falls on me. I'm the DRI. And the same goes for all of those other functions that you saw there. We find it's really good to assign a DRI for every part of a project, even if you have multiple copywriters, for example, or multiple developers. Having one person that answers for all of development really helps with accountability, and then you can move faster in identifying what went wrong or what needs to change. Anyway, so when we started the think phase of this process, we began with research, and that started with our conversion flows, doing an audit of how a user started on our site and how they moved through our funnel and then ultimately converted on our product. And what we found was that our flows were huge and complicated, and we had multiple different conversion flows for one product. And those simple flows, the few that you see there that are really simple, they converted about 2 to 3 times higher than their more complex counterparts. So like the sales software conversion flows that you see down there that are complicated, or those marketing software conversion flows, those had a much lower conversion rate than the CRM conversion flow, which was essentially just 3 steps. So we revamped our conversion flows, and we created flows that look like this. It's 3 steps no matter what. That's the only way that you can convert on these products. Super simple, and we called this a get started flow. You can actually see this flow live, and you can use it now by going to hubspot.com/products/get started. We also looked at our user journeys and what it looked for actual users that went to HubSpot.com and learned about our product and signed up. This is one of the powerful things about the HubSpot software, is that it's analytics on a personal basis. So HubSpot doesn't just look at numbers, it looks at the people. So we were able to specifically see what Raymond H. did on our site throughout multiple sessions. And we saw, oh, wait a second, he signed up for multiple products, but he never logged into any of them. And then we saw Hassan signed up for the same product twice, but he never logged in. We realized that people were seeing these sign-up flows as the login form to our product because they looked like login forms. So this was a key insight in terms of how our conversion funnel would be designed and what those interfaces would look like. We then collected some qualitative feedback by performing interviews with users and looking at we send out some batch emails to customers when they start, or people when they land on our site. And a lot of the time they reply to it and they give us pretty good feedback, like this individual who said, I didn't continue the process because your website is too damn cluttered, it doesn't flow, it makes no sense. That was some good feedback around cognitive load that we were experiencing in a bunch of our designs. And then when we had individuals that had particularly interesting feedback, we would follow up with additional interviews or surveys to help get an idea for what they really meant by that feedback and what specifically we could change in the design. So here we were asking them, when you're evaluating a piece of software, how do you want to learn about it? And we found that a lot of people actually like learning through video or reading on a site. Very few people want to read things like reviews on G2 Crowd or have a chat with the sales rep. That's just in the case of HubSpot.com. That you might not necessarily see that apply elsewhere, but that was powerful data for us. And what this allowed us to do was really focus our project on just a few pages and areas of the site so that we weren't caught up in all 2,000 pages, but rather we were looking at 39 core pages, which was reduced from an original estimate that we had. This project would take about 70 different pages that we would need to work on. So 39 core pages were identified through this research. That's the stuff that we would be working on. And we found that to be really important. If you're dealing with a large site and you feel overwhelmed, do the research to figure out where your greatest opportunities are and where you should be focusing. And don't feel bad about just focusing your project on those areas, so that you can make sure that you actually get something live instead of work on the whole site and be overambitious and never get anything live at all. Once we had this identified, we then moved into content and copy and producing the content that would actually be populating these designs. So this began with research. Weirdly enough, even though we went through that whole research process that you just saw, we were not done with copy-related research. There was still a lot more poking that we could do into the copy, and we wanted to figure out what messages were going to resonate the most with our users and our customers. And what we've really found is that high-quality research is really the primary determining factor in the success of copy. This is a little unintuitive. When we create copy, a lot of the time we see the words or the things that resonate with us, but really the best copywriters are also great researchers. They're people that can pull out good insights and justify objectively why they're taking the copy and the messaging in the direction that they are. So actually the majority of the work that our copywriters did on this project was research. And then they created some content docs. And this goes back to sort of Google Apps and the stuff that I was talking about, how we would share that there. They would make it with like a crude structure so we could generally see how they want the story to be told, and then we could comment on it in the Google Docs and change the copy. And then they would actually put this into rough wireframes, something that looks like this. I would give them templates and elements, and then they would throw the copy in there and move it around. What you're really looking at here is copy first design, which is to say that the content determines the design, not the other way around. We do copy first, we do content first before we touch the pixels. And this is important to us because we've seen in previous copy v copy tests that copy alone can increase conversion rates in the neighborhood of 20%. So that was critical to that goal that we had to increase conversion on this site. At the same time, we were also evaluating the approach that we could take to design. And the truth is that this is a little bit of a tough thing to do because aesthetics can be a difficult thing to get right and an even more difficult thing to measure. And a lot of the time, we're going to get caught up in our subjective debates over what we personally think looks best. But if we reposition the way that we think about aesthetics, we can actually get close to measuring them objectively and taking a very objective approach to our designs. The key is an understanding that the best aesthetics are going to account for what the user considers to be beautiful more than what the stakeholder considers to be beautiful. And that is something that we can measure. So that's the approach that we took here. We started by evaluating illustrations. They were a different approach that we wanted to see if it would make sense to bring it into the design. And so we had around 10 or 12 different illustrative styles that we tested with users, and we also tested illustrations that we ourselves didn't create. They were from elsewhere on the web to see what style of illustration spoke to our users, how they could best tell the story. And it was weird because internally at HubSpot, we were all on board for illustrations. We all thought it was a good idea. Everybody was ready to go with this stuff. But then when we tested it with users, we found that over half of them didn't really like illustrations. And nobody could really agree on an illustrative direction. We would test one form of illustrations and people would say, oh, this looks really childish. And other people would say, oh, I like how this helps tell the story. We could never get to a consensus. And the same sort of thing happened with drop shadows. We introduced a bunch of aesthetic elements like this into our tests, and we found that users didn't generally like this type of stuff. I had put together an entire Envision board of inspiration from around the web, from people in our category and outside of our category, and how we wanted, like the direction that we wanted to take our color palette and our typography in. And we tested all of this stuff. We went through this entire board and tested it using a tool called Usability Hub. And what we found is a pretty good pulse for what resonated the most with our users. And what we concluded is that across the board, clean and conservative designs actually outperformed the more design-forward counterparts. So in this world of design, we get caught up in the stuff we see on Dribble and everything like that, and it's like, oh, I want to, do this diffuse drop shadow, or typography that is broken up into different lines and maybe harder to read, but it looks really good. And we found actually users don't really like the trends or appreciate the trends in the same way that we do. They want something that's clean, easy to understand, and easy to use. So we took this information and we moved into design. And we started actually creating pixels at this point. And that began with wireframes. We skipped the sketches and paper prototypes. It didn't really feel necessary for this project. And really what we wanted to do was establish the structure and the hierarchy so that our developers could begin creating the framework and the loose code that would then house our final designs, and they could experiment with a few of the more forward-thinking elements that we wanted to bring in, like a weird scroll pattern or animations and interactions and things like that. We then took these wireframes and we turned them into mock-ups where we could start to establish the visual direction. We created prototypes for unique interactions or things that were harder to convey in just a static image. And this was ranging everything from like the interaction that you're looking at here to full mobile interactive prototypes that we could test with users. And what this ultimately resulted in was over 100 wireframes, over 60 mockups, and 4 full prototypes of the site. So all 39 pages prototyped. We then established our CSS and global elements so that we could start to code that stuff up and apply it across all of the visual designs. And then we tested it pre-launch. These are click maps on the left and Deuteranopia color blindness simulations on the right. So we wanted to see how this stuff was going to do from an accessibility standpoint. And then we produced some videos and elements to use video to help tell the story of our product. And you can see, again, on the left, that's a pre-launch heat map. So we were testing a PNG there. And on the right, that's a post-launch heat map. So that's tested on our live site with live users. And we see this pattern where the core CTA is the thing that's clicked the most, but the second most clicked thing is the video. Users like to learn about products through video. In our case, 65% of our users prefer to evaluate our software by watching a video. And what we found is that when we included a video on a product page, it increased conversion by about 300%. So that was huge. We invested a lot in that area. Once we were comfortable with a lot of the design direction, we saw that development was taking off very early, and they would be going through the process of ultimately publishing 130 different pages live to HubSpot.com. So this was really ambitious from a development perspective. All of these different domains that you see on the right, everything was being localized and published to those domains. 39 core pages to the site were published. And we did all that in spectacular fashion by pushing the button at Inbound 2016 while product announcements were happening on our keynote stage. So that picture down there is me pushing the button on some pages with our other developers during the keynote itself from backstage. So we had this cool reveal, and as soon as we did that, we saw that page speed increased. We had a 60% reduction in CSS assets. So that was another sort of goal that we built into this, was making the site faster, lighter weight, more efficient. So what kind of results did we get from this? We moved into the check phase, which is, in my opinion, the most important part of the Lean UX process. And this is really where the work starts to begin. Once we launch the site and we press that button, that's about 25% of the work that we will ever do on this design. The remaining 75% happens starting here and in the additional iterations that happen afterwards. So we found that conversion actually turned out pretty good. We were tracking over 90 different conversion flows with a dashboard that looks like this. And this is pulling data from 3 different data sources: Amplitude, HubSpot, and Google Analytics 360. And we doubled our conversion rate globally on HubSpot.com. That resulted in a 35% increase in demos on the HubSpot products. We doubled our call volume generated by HubSpot.com and had a 38% increase in our sales chats that were initiated. And what this ultimately resulted in was a 27% increase in product signups across all HubSpot products. If you think back to that revenue metric that I shared earlier, you can do a little bit of math and realize that this was a hugely impactful design change, not just for the site, but for the health of our business as well. And while that's all great, we didn't really stop there. We continued to iterate and run tests and find out what was going to work the best. And that's the power of this process, is that it focuses on using your learnings to drive your design that ultimately get you to results and then doing it all over again. And that's really what we found to be the determining factor in the success of a design. When you have a well-informed team that uses data, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to inform their design and does it in a humble and proactive way, they get results. They know what they're designing. They know what they're doing. They're not creating for themselves. They're creating for the people that are actually going to use these products, and they do it quickly. And we see numbers like this. That really, to me, stresses the importance of a cyclical, iterative, fluid process like this, and we can start to see how you really can create a lean enterprise. If you want to learn more about this, I just recently did a podcast with Jared Spool of UIE, User Interface Engineering. He's like an OG in the UX community. And Jeff Gotthelf, the guy who quite literally wrote the book Lean UX, he invented this process. We did a podcast for User Interface Engineering that you can find at uxd.to/UIE. This is a new podcast that Jared started. It's a pretty cool show. I would encourage you to listen to that more if you want to hear more about how we approached this project and what we learned, and really how Lean UX works in an enterprise setting. And then if you want to read more into the details of this project or share with your team a lot of the stuff that I talked about here, you can find a case study that I published on HubSpot's blog at uxd.to/study. HubSpot's information is on the left if you want to learn more about us. My information is on the right if you want to stalk me. I've got a bunch of essays and stuff like that that will dive into this more. And then you can go to uxd.to/guide at any point for resources from this talk and the other talks that I give. I noticed several times people were bringing up in the chat, they're saying like, what are the tools that you were using here, or wanting me to dive more into the processes, which I can do in our Q&A. But really, I've built this guide at uxd.to/guide so that you can see all the tools that we use and get the links to those. That can be pretty powerful. But I believe that we have some time left over for me to answer some questions and dive into more detail with you. So I would love to do that right now.